Seder, of course, to me was always something very sacred, which we did every year, and it's a memorial of the time when my ancestors was freed from slavery, brought to the promised land. And there's one important aspect is that every Jew who participates in that Seder has to consider himself, it's in the book that we use for the Haggadah, that we use for the Passover, has to consider himself as he himself participated in that exodus and was in slavery and was out, so that whatever God did for those Jews 2,000, 3,000 years ago, whatever, he did for you today. So it's, I guess, if I had to use the word sacrament, it was almost, well, we didn't believe in sacrament. I mean, I had no clue what a sacrament was then, okay?
Well, you could have said it was a mystery. I mean, that's what the Latin word would be, mystery. It was a great mystery.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it wasn't just a remembrance. You know, it was a memorial. You were part of that group. You know, it's a time. So it's still going on, in other words. Not that I was in Egypt again and going through that, no, but I was somehow, time didn't, that's what we do, as I eventually get to in the Eucharist, you know. Anyway, so it's, like I said, so when I looked at that, you know, I said, I was also reading John chapter 6, you know, where you talked about the body. You know, I had no problem with reading that and saying that's literal. Of course, I didn't like it. I said, how the heck can this guy give us his body to eat? That's cannibalism. You know, I had no problem with the universe being created in 6 days, and science shows not millions of years. I'm an engineer, you know, that makes sense. But this is something else. This is something science can't deal with. It has to be something on faith, you know. And I always wondered, how is he ever going to do it? And then as I went through the Last Supper, okay, and I started seeing in the Seder setting, okay, this whole thing, all the elements are there from a Seder, except, of course, the washing of the feet. That was something Jesus had added, and there's a little bit with Judas, you know. But then after doing the blessing of the bread, the typical, we do it, or the challah that we used at that, or the matzah that we used at that, was unleavened bread. I should take it, I don't know if they used matzah in those days. The unleavened bread, he then says, this is my body. Whoops. I said, and then after the meal, you know, we have our meal and this conversation. Then we have the cup of blessing, which is grace after meals. And then, you know, right after the cup of blessing, he then says, this is my blood, the new covenant. I said, wow. Now I see. Because I was always wondering how I got from John 6 to the real body. And it was at that Last Supper. So he didn't do anything. Remember, the Old Testament, the Seder, in the book of Exodus, chapter, that's the only thing from 12, this is a perpetual institution. And I used to ask, Christian, do you celebrate the Passover? Fundamentalists, I used to ask anyway. They said, no. Well, why not? It says in the Bible, you must till the end, it's perpetual. I mean, it's clear, you know. He said, no. I said, but then when I saw that Jesus taking the Seder and giving it a new meaning, you know, what it's really all about, you know, that's, in other words, from slavery of sin, as the New Testament writer says, to redemption, to the promised land, which is heaven. You know what I mean? I said, now I understand. Now it becomes crystal clear. You know, again, it's God's grace. Right? You know, you want to come other Jews. I can't get other Jews to see this. Anyway, that's from that point on, then that was it. That was the final clincher. You know, I said, now it does go on. Yeah, the Mass. I mean, the edict in 12 is intact. It remains intact. You know, we still celebrate, you know, the Passover, but it's now new Passover, the New Testament. Anyway, so I decided then it's a Catholic church. When I knocked on the door one day at the rectory, I told my wife, and I knocked on the rectory, and priest answers the door, says, I want to come into the Catholic church. Oh, yeah, okay, sure, come on in. He sat down with me, great guy. He said, well, it's going to take about 4 months. I said, what? What for? I said, I'm ready to go now, you know. I said, I've been through it, I've studied, and, you know, I've come to this conclusion. Yeah, you know that, but I don't know if you know that. Right. I want to know what you know, so anyway, that's great, 4 months. And then I was baptized on February 23rd, 1963. And my son was 5 years old at the time. he went in before me, so he still brags to this day that he came into church before I did.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, he was baptized.
Baptized first.
6 months later, my wife was baptized. And I can't go through the whole story, but finally, we talked a lot, you know, because she wasn't much of practicing. And then, but anyway, 6 months later, she did come in. And that was one interesting story about that, because one day later, we were going to take our daughter, who was born a year later, to be baptized. And then my mother came out, because we were having a little reception afterwards. And she said, "Where are you going?" So I said, "Well, we're going to church to have the baby out, but you don't have to go." So she puts her coat on, so I'm going. So she goes, she watches the whole ceremony in the church. And so my wife asked her that, "What do you think? I mean, you know, being in this place." She said, "Oh, it's the house of God, isn't it?" I was blown off she never converted or anything like that, but, you know, that was just a simple thinking of like,